Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, May 30th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Democratic Party's investment in minority communities in an effort to win elections in the 2022 midterm elections and well beyond then, going into the 2024 presidential election and even elections beyond then. Now, I do want to say, first things first, I apologize if there's any background noise. I'm currently at the beach with some of my friends for our senior beach week. It's the thing you normally do when you leave high school, so that's why you might hear a few things in the background, but that's where I will be till June 5th, and then I will be back recording in my normal location. But just wanted to make that clear just in case there was any background noise that you heard and were wondering what that was. In addition, I've also turned down the sensitivity of the microphone, so I sound a little bit different. That's probably why. If I sound a little bit different, that's probably why, and it will be picking up a little bit less, so you might have to turn your volume up slightly more than normal. But first, priority for the Democrats for the 2022 midterm elections is expanding on where they won back in 2020. Now, the 2020 House election results were anything but good for Democrats, but I do think that winning the majority was the first step, at least at preventing major losses in the 2022 midterm elections. Elections do always lead up and eventually fall back down for the incumbent party. Right now, the Democrats are in the majority in both the House, the Senate, and in the White House, but two of those could be gone in 2022. And the Democratic Congressional Committee here, which is essentially, it's the DCCC that sends out ads. I'm on their mailing list for both the RNCC and also the DCCC. DCCC, it sounds a little bit weird, but essentially these committees fundraise money and send out political ads for certain groups of people in order to flip them or have them vote for a certain candidate. And in this case, the Democratic Party seems to be trying out something going into the 2020 election results and expanding beyond that. And it says here that they are making a major investment, a 7-figure investment into this democracy summer program to essentially allow House Democrats to reach communities of color. Now, the reason why this is important is, I think, for very obvious reasons, in an effort to increase the turnout amongst minority groups. We already know that minority groups back the Democratic Party at heavy rates, but if they can turn out to the electorate where the 13% of black voters in the country or the 13% of Hispanic voters in the country increases to 14, 15, 16, monumental things will happen for the Democratic Party. The 2020 election, they nearly lost the election. I'm not going to try to say that they didn't. They nearly lost the Senate, they nearly lost the House, and they nearly lost the presidency. 2020 was ultimately a close election in which the GOP had gains in the House elections, lost in the Senate, and also lost the White House. But for this, for what it's worth, the Democratic Party, of course, was still able to win and did so by winning over minority voters at very high rates. Black voters split for the Democratic Party 87-12. That's the largest margin of victory we've seen for any demographic group. Hispanic voters 65-32. Asian voters 61-34, and other, which is essentially just, Pacific Islander, Native American, etc., 55-41. So in every group except for white voters, the Democratic Party wins, and wins by a lot, the narrowest being a 14-point victory and the largest being a 75-point victory. And, that's why the Democratic Party is at this point where they're looking at minority groups and saying, we need them to turn out to vote. We need them to be here in 2022. We need them to be turning out at the same way that they did in 2020 and well beyond that. Because what we've seen so far is that the Democratic Party, when it does come down to major elections, a lot of the times they do end up flopping. They do end up faltering to the Republicans because of the inability to turn out voters in certain regions. And also, the Democratic Party might be trying to further expand on the margin of victory for Joe Biden, which you might find interesting that I actually covered a few videos back, was the fact that Hillary Clinton outperformed Joe Biden amongst many demographic groups, amongst black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, every demographic group except for white voters. That was the difference. While Hillary Clinton was able to run up the numbers even better than Biden, she ultimately lost because white voters make up over 67% of the voting group. It was just an exceptionally high year for minority turnout, and even then, Republicans still ended up coming close, largely because of the heavy block of the voting group simply being white voters. The only demographic group race-wise that backs Republicans are white voters. So the DCCC acknowledges that, I think, but also wants to ensure that minority communities do turn out to vote the way that they were supposed to, and did actually in 2018. 2018 was not an easily won election. Democrats required a number of groups of minority citizens to turn out in areas, you're talking about New Mexico, you're talking about Iowa, areas where you don't necessarily see heavy turnout amongst minority voters relative to white voters that turned out in 2018 and landed Democrats winning back control of the United States House of Representatives. It happened in New York, it happened in New Jersey, it happened in California, it happened across the nation, and Democrats were able to succeed because of it. Well, then you fast forward to 2020, the House election results weren't as good, but that's why Democrats need to further expand. Because if they were winning by such solid margins amongst a record-breaking turnout year, what happens when white voters revert back to their traditional Republican voting group and then minority voters don't turn out to vote? The DCCC is making a very good effort here, and while I don't think 7 figures is necessarily enough, it's a good start for Democrats because they recognize that the House of Representatives will likely be the easiest thing for the GOP to pick up, mainly because of redistricting, in addition to it just being potentially a wave year. But all in all, I'm looking at the House elections in 2022, and I would place my bets on the GOP. Even though Democrats are at this point where they're trying to make significant investments or trying to turn out minority groups, which eventually, could pay back, could help Democrats down the line. I don't think that they're going to see a full force effort for minority citizens the way they saw it happen in 2020 or 2018. The realism of it all is that 2022 is likely going to be a good year for Republicans. The House of Representatives, after a census year, is going to dramatically change, and Republicans have a disproportionate amount of control in these states. They have control of Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, states with large amounts of electoral votes, 40 in Texas, 30 in Florida. I mean, you're looking at a number of states where Republicans have a lot of control and will use that to their advantage. Not even to mention, Ohio, where there are 17 Republican electoral votes from the 2020 election. That means 15 congressional districts. Republicans essentially have free reign across many states, over 180 districts that they can draw to their liking. Democrats don't even have 90 districts to draw to their liking. The rest are decided by independent commissions or are single district states, which makes it even more difficult for Democrats to be at a point where they can combat the redistricting by doing the same exact thing. Because even if they wanted to, they would still be behind by 100 districts relative to the Republicans. So it seems as if they are going to try to do that. I do believe they will try to redistrict in favor of themselves, but they are going to use this minority outreach as a means to counteract significant losses. And, just looking at the exit polling data, I'm not surprised by these racial breakdowns, but I do think that Democrats do have room to improve. Because if Hillary Clinton could do it, a Democrat certainly could in 2022. When you're looking at some of these districts, they may not necessarily have been full on for Joe Biden, or they may have specifically liked President Trump. But without President Trump on the ballot, we might see a reversal of minority groups. But the thing is, 2016 electorate is different from the 2022 electorate. As the years go on, the minority groups do increase in terms of population and consequently increase in terms of representation and voting power. So for white voters to be in a position where 20 years ago, you would be seeing them 75% plus of the population in terms of voting, that has decreased. And as the years go on, we've seen studies show that by 2040, 2050, the majority of the country will be comprised of minority citizens. And I know that sounds like a paradox, but think about it this way. They're not all a monolith. Black voters are different from Hispanic voters and different from Asian voters. And even amongst those own groups, there are their own subsections. The thing is, white voters have the overwhelming majority in this country. So when I say, the majority of the country will be minority citizens, it's because I'm not going to say, oh, it's white people and then minorities. You have black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, Native American voters. You have a whole plethora of people here that can't be grouped in a monolith. And I understand the same argument can be applied to white voters, but you do have to understand that there is a very, I would say, big difference there. And that's exactly why when I say majority minority, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not. It's just because, for lack of a better word, to group all of these groups together, minority is the word for it, but when you actually get down to, the breakdown, no, the minority does not become the majority in that sense, because they're not all the same people, they're not all the same voting groups, but there are very clear distinctions between different voting groups, which is why when you break it down, you can sort of go by, race in terms of exit polling data, but of course there are, thousands of more data points to go through. This is just the surface level understanding. So I've had to address that in a couple of comments before. I never really addressed that in a video. Just wanted to point that out, that when I say majority minority, you know what I mean. So continuing on, like I was saying before, I'm not surprised by these margins, but Democrats certainly have room to improve. And while, they may see a reversal of white voters, what they could also do is invest in those as well, which they are doing now. This investment in minority citizens, I think, comes as not a surprise, but as, not a surprise at all, but as a headline, because minority voters typically don't vote at high rates compared to white voters. Generally speaking, you'll learn this in your civics class. You'll learn this from, general understanding of United States history, that older, whiter, and richer voters vote at a much higher rate than, economically disadvantaged people, than people of color, essentially, younger voters. All of the groups that Democrats rely on to win don't vote at high rates. They simply don't. But Republicans, however, do. When you look at low turnout elections, 2010, 2014, what happens? Republicans win in a landslide. Well, what happened in 2018? Democrats were able to win back control of the United States House. What happened in 2020? A record-breaking turnout year. Yes, Republicans had some good results, but I'm not going to, say that Democrats didn't win a trifecta, the first trifecta they've had since the election of 2008. So 2020, while not necessarily the best year for Democrats or a good year per se, there were some significant advantages because they now control the Senate, they now control the House, and of course, they have the White House. So the Democratic, committee here with minority groups certainly needs to do better. I think that they need to be able to expand on these margins because there is room. Again, I will reiterate, if Hillary Clinton could do it, I'm sure other Democrats could as well. I think Hillary Clinton was individually a strong candidate amongst minority voters, but there are, of course, better people. There's always a better person. There was someone better relative to Joe Biden in terms of minority voters. Would it be Hillary Clinton? Probably not after the 2016 election, but comparatively, yes. When you look at Barack Obama's margin compared to Joe Biden, yes, they were better amongst minority voters. And the Democratic Party needs to realize, what did Obama do? What did Clinton do that Biden didn't? And I think that the attention of the 2020 election was more focused on the Rust Belt rather than it was on minority citizens. But now the Democrats are reverting back. And I think they also do think that white voters haven't returned back to the GOP the way that they are expected to. White voters turned away from the GOP largely because of President Trump. Yes, they backed him by 17 points, but if you look at the margin for Mitt Romney, it was larger. If you look at the margin of victory for other candidates, or, Trump even in 2016, it was larger. Because back then, Donald Trump was able to tap into this base, but after 4 years of his presidency and 4 years of the GOP vehemently backing him, they turned away from that party. And that's why Georgia went blue. That's why Arizona went blue. That's why Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania turned back to the Democrats. That's why Nebraska's 2nd district voted for Biden by 7 points. That's why swing states turned into likely states for the Democrats. Minnesota, New Hampshire, which was the closest state of the 2016 election, went to Biden by over 7 points. The thing is, looking at the election results, Joe Biden may have improved amongst white voters, and that may have helped him and did win him the election, but minority voters moved away. So if Democrats are under the assumption that white voters won't revert back to the GOP, which they very well might not because of the close association with President Trump to this day, they're going to expand on the margins. So if they can keep white voters at a 58-41 loss, and they can expand amongst minority voters, Democrats might actually have a shot at doing well in 2022. But that's a big if, because midterm elections historically advantage the opposition party, and that's likely what's going to happen. But I'm also going to say that Democrats, if they can do this right, if they can make this investment and actually use it, and it becomes advantageous in the future or now to continue investing mainly in minority communities, I think that will eventually come back and help Democrats, and they'll start to invest more and more money. The reason why this is a headline is because this isn't something that is deemed as too regular. I don't think that the Democratic Party really realizes just how much minority citizens have an impact on the outcome of their elections. When you look at the election results in the Senate race in Georgia, how did that happen? That happened mainly because of people of color, mainly black organizers, more specifically black women organizers. The things that happened in Georgia didn't happen overnight. They happened because of Stacey Abrams and people like her. What's happening in in Arizona didn't happen overnight. That was with the Democratic Party organizing for the past 4 or 8 years to win the state of Arizona. And they've put, a lot of effort into winning. 2018 was their first victory. 2020 was their second. And there surely will be plenty more. 2022 might be the next one. So I think Democrats will start to see this return on investment in 2022 or 2024, and will consequently start investing more and more money. And I think that is good for the Democratic Party to come to this point of realization where, yes, they've always known that minority citizens are going to vote for them, but I think they've largely taken them for granted, and that they haven't necessarily tapped into a way to have them turn out at high rates like they did in 2020. And 2020 is a little bit difficult to analyze because we were in the middle of a pandemic. We were in the middle of the most important election of our lifetimes to date, and I think that the Democratic Party is going to start to recognize what they need to do and figure out how to do it through this investment, which could prove to be very beneficial but only time will tell. We'll see what happens in 2022. We'll see which percent of the electorate was white voters or black voters or Hispanic voters or Asian voters, etc. I think that there will be some pretty interesting election results in 2022, but again, only time will tell at this point. We just have to wait and see, but Democrats seem to be on the right track for not only the 2022 midterm elections, but elections well beyond there. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.